The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the frost-laced grass in shades of silver and gold. Ethan Cole stepped out of his weathered ranch house, the creak of the porch boards echoing in the quiet morning. His breath steamed in the cold air as he scanned the fence line, expecting nothing unusual, until his eyes froze on a dark, unmoving shape. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags caught in the wire, wind-blown in during the night. But as he drew closer, the truth came into focus. A horse. No, not just any horse. A wild mare, gaunt and trembling, her coat caked with mud and blood, her head drooping low as though the effort to keep it raised was too much. She was tied to his fence with a frayed rope that bit cruelly into her skin. Every shallow breath made her ribs stand out like the bars of a broken cage. Her once strong legs shook beneath her, knees buckling as if surrender was moments away. A faint, pitiful sound escaped her cracked lips, more sigh than whinny. Ethan stopped a few paces away, a strange tightness in his chest. This was no accident. Someone had left her here. That's when he saw it, the crumpled, dirt-smeared scrap of paper tied to the rope near her neck. The writing was barely legible, but the words, once deciphered, cut through him like cold steel. She's all that's left. Take care of her, or let her die. For a moment, he simply stood there, the note trembling in his hand. The phrasing was strange, almost personal, and the handwriting, it nagged at the edge of his memory. But he pushed the thought aside. Whoever left her must have known he lived here, must have known something about him. A part of him wanted to turn away, to tell himself it wasn't his problem. He'd spent the last decade avoiding situations exactly like this. Broken things that needed fixing, living creatures that could die on his watch. He knew too well what it felt like to try and fail to save something. The mare's gaze found his. Her eyes were dull, but beneath the cloudiness was something that stopped him. A flicker of will, a fragile thread refusing to break. Ethan cursed under his breath, stepped forward, and cut the rope. The mare didn't try to run. She simply swayed, then crumpled into the frost-bitten grass. He crouched beside her, pressing a steadying hand to her neck. Her heartbeat was weak, irregular. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice soft despite the tension in his jaw. "You're safe now." She was too far gone to stand on her own. He fetched a blanket from the barn, draped it over her trembling body, and returned with a bucket of water. She sniffed at it but could barely drink. The clouds above had been gathering unnoticed, but now the first growl of thunder rolled across the valley. He glanced toward the darkening sky. A storm was coming. He had to get her inside. With slow patience, Ethan slid his arms under her chest, bracing her against his shoulder as he half lifted, half dragged her toward the barn. Her weight bore down on him, sending a sharp ache into his back, but he didn't stop. Each step left deep impressions in the muddy ground, the wind picking up around them. By the time they reached the barn doors, rain was beginning to spit from the sky. He laid her down gently on a bed of straw, the scent of dust and hay wrapping around them. She blinked at him once, long and slow, as though acknowledging his effort. He moved quickly, fetching a heat lamp from the corner, rubbing her legs to coax warmth back into them, checking her breathing. The barn lights flickered as the storm pressed closer. When he went to gather more supplies, his hand brushed against something coarse, tangled in the rope he'd cut earlier. It was another folded paper, smaller than the first, almost hidden in the fibers. He slipped it into his pocket, intending to read it once the mare was stable. The wind outside howled, rattling the tin roof. Lightning flashed, followed almost instantly by the crack of thunder. The mare flinched at the sound, her hooves twitching weakly. He stayed near her head, murmuring low words meant more to calm himself than her. For a while, the only sounds were the storm's rage and her labored breathing. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the barn in relentless rhythm. Ethan's mind wandered to questions he didn't want to ask. Who had done this? Why here? And what did they mean by "she's all that's left"? The smaller paper burned in his pocket, demanding his attention. But just as he reached for it, the lights in the barn flickered violently and went out, leaving him in darkness broken only by the thin glow of the heat lamp. He stayed still, letting his eyes adjust, his ears tuned to every sound. The mare shifted faintly in the straw, and he thought he heard something else, Something human. A faint creak of the barn door against the wind. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Only shadows and rain. He tightened his grip on the folded paper, but didn't open it. Not yet. The storm was bad enough. Whatever was written inside could wait until morning. For now, the priority was keeping her alive until the sun returned. Outside, the world was swallowed by the storm. Inside, in the dim light, Ethan knelt beside the half-dead mare, his hand resting gently against her neck. He didn't understand why saving her mattered so much, only that it did. The note's words still echoed in his mind, and for the first time in years, he felt the pull of something he'd long since buried. Responsibility, maybe even purpose. The wind roared against the walls, but he stayed where he was, listening to her uneven breaths, wondering how far the storm would go before it broke, and wondering, too, what secrets the morning light might bring. The storm had not eased until deep into the night, and when Ethan woke, it was to the muted hush of a sky washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and hay. He rose from the chair where he had slept lightly, a blanket over his shoulders, and found the mare still lying in the straw, her sides rising in slow, uneven rhythm. Her eyes followed him as he moved, and though she made no sound, there was a fragile awareness in them now, as if some small part of her had decided not to give up. He fetched a bucket of warm water and set it near her head. This time, she sipped a little, her cracked lips trembling with the effort. He spoke to her quietly, nonsense words mostly, but steady and low. It wasn't much, yet the moment carried the faintest thread of connection, and Ethan found himself holding on to it. The folded paper from the rope still sat in his pocket. He hadn't touched it since last night, though the weight of it felt heavier than it should. He pulled it free and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was rough, almost carved into the page by a heavy hand. Asterisk, you owe her, more than you know. She is your second chance. Asterisk, there was no name, only the initials LH. The letters brought a coldness to his gut. He hadn't thought of those initials in years, but they belonged to a man who had once been closer than a brother, Luke Harrington. Their last parting had been violent, a shouting match that left Ethan without the heart to continue the work he'd built his life around. And now, out of nowhere, here was this broken mare tied to his fence, carrying a message from the man he'd sworn never to see again. The creak of the barn door pulled his attention. A tall woman stepped inside, brushing her raincoat free of droplets. Dr. Grace Morgan, the town's veterinarian, had a habit of appearing without waiting for an invitation. "Word travels," she said simply, setting her bag down. Her sharp eyes swept over the mare's condition, her mouth tightening. "She's worse than I expected." Ethan said nothing as Grace knelt, running her hands along the mare's legs, lifting her lips to check the gums, listening to her heart with a stethoscope. Finally, she sat back on her heels. "She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and in shock. If you want her to live, she needs more than casual care. You'll have to fight for her." The words landed heavier than they should have. He could have told her he didn't ask for this, that he hadn't gone looking to take on another life. But instead, he found himself asking, "What do I do first?" Grace outlined a regimen: fluids, soft feed, gentle exercise once she regained strength. Her tone was brisk, clinical, but underneath was an unspoken challenge. She knew his history, knew how easily he'd walked away from responsibility before. When she left, the barn felt quieter, almost too quiet. Ethan crouched beside the mare again. Her eyes were on him, unblinking. He thought of the note, of Luke's hand in all this, and a tangle of resentment and curiosity coiled in his chest. By mid-afternoon, a faint warmth began to return to the mare's skin. She shifted slightly in the straw, enough to press her muzzle briefly against his knee. The contact startled him, not in fear, but in the sudden, unbidden rush of memory it stirred. Years ago, there had been another horse, a wild stallion with the same deep amber eyes. The stallion had been the pride of his breeding program, a creature with strength and spirit that drew buyers from across the state. And then, one storm-lashed night, he was gone, sold without Ethan's consent, a betrayal that tore apart both his business and his trust. That was Luke's doing. Now here lay this mare, half dead, abandoned, but carrying the same eyes as the stallion he'd lost. The resemblance was too close to ignore. He rose, pacing the barn, the questions multiplying. Was she a stallion's bloodline? Why would Luke bring her here? And what did he mean by calling her a second chance? The day wore on in steady routine. He coaxed her to drink again, offered her handfuls of soaked hay, rubbed her legs to keep the blood moving. Slowly, her breathing deepened. She was still fragile, still caught between life and death, but something in her had shifted. In the late afternoon, the sound of tires crunching gravel announced a visitor. Ethan's daughter, Claire, stepped out of her truck, her arms folded tight against the chill. Her visits were rare and usually strained. "I heard you've got another stray," she said when she reached the barn door, her voice cool, but not without a trace of concern. "It's not like that," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure what he meant. Claire's gaze landed on the mare, and for a moment, she said nothing. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly, but the guardedness returned quickly. "You can barely take care of yourself, Dad. Why do this?" He had no answer she'd believe, so he only said, "Because she needs it." Claire shook her head and turned toward the door. "Just don't get in over your head again." Her footsteps crunched away, leaving the air heavier than before. The sky was deepening into twilight when Ethan returned to the mare's side. He crouched, brushing her mane away from her eyes. "We'll get through this," he told her quietly, unsure if he was speaking to her or himself. Somewhere beyond the barn, coyotes began their eerie chorus. The mare's ears flicked at the sound, but she did not try to move. He stayed beside her until the last of the daylight faded, the heat lamp casting a small, defiant pool of warmth against the growing night. As he stood to close the barn doors, his eyes caught on the note again where it lay on the workbench. The word seemed sharper in the dim light, as if the page itself wanted to push him toward something he wasn't ready to face. "You owe her more than you know." He folded it slowly, slipped it back into his pocket, and latched the doors against the cold. He didn't know where this was leading, but the weight of the day had already shifted something in him. The questions could wait. For now, the only thing that mattered was that the mare was still breathing, and that he was here to see it. Morning came with the sound of hooves shifting against straw. Ethan stirred from the chair in the corner, his back aching from another night in the barn. The mare was on her feet for the first time, legs thin but steady, her head lowered to nibble cautiously at the hay he'd left. It was a small victory, but one that eased the tightness in his chest. He approached slowly, speaking in that same low tone he'd used since she arrived. She flicked an ear toward him, but didn't back away. He placed a shallow bucket of warm ash in front of her, watching her sniff, then take tentative mouthfuls. Each bite felt like a step forward, however slight. Days settled into a pattern. He rose before dawn to check her, fed her small portions through the day, and walked her slowly in the paddock when the weather allowed. Her coat began to show faint hints of its original sheen beneath the grime, and her eyes, still wary, were clearer now, less clouded by exhaustion. It wasn't just her that was changing. Ethan felt it in himself, too. The quiet hours in the barn no longer felt like a burden. He spoke to her more, even when she gave no sign of listening. He found himself repairing broken boards, oiling hinges, fixing the leak in the roof he'd ignored for years. The place felt alive again, in a way it hadn't since before everything fell apart. One afternoon, Grace returned, her boots muddy from the thawing ground. She examined the mare with practiced hands, nodding slowly as she checked her weight and breathing. "She's improving," she said, "but there's something you should know." Ethan waited, his stomach tightening. "She's pregnant," Grace continued, her voice calm but serious. "If she's going to carry the foal to term, you'll need to keep building her strength. It won't be easy." The words hit harder than he expected. He looked at the mare, this half-starved creature, and tried to picture her carrying new life inside her. It seemed impossible, yet the thought of giving up didn't cross his mind. Grace gathered her bag and paused at the door. "I don't know who left her here, Ethan, but maybe it wasn't just to save her. Maybe it was to save you too." She left without waiting for an answer, her words lingering in the air. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dim light of the barn, the note from Luke spread out on his knee. The more he stared at it, the more the pieces of the past shifted into place. The mare's eyes, those amber eyes, were too familiar. They were the same as the stallion he'd raised from a colt, the one Luke had stolen and sold. If she carried his bloodline, the foal would be more than a chance. It would be a bridge back to everything Ethan had lost. The thought stirred old pain, but also something warmer, something he hadn't felt in years: hope. A few days later, as Ethan was leading the mare around the paddock, Claire's truck rolled up the drive. She stepped out, her face a mixture of caution and curiosity. "I was in the area," she said, as if she needed an excuse to be there. She watched him walk the mare, her expression softening despite herself. "She's looking better," Claire admitted. "She's strong," Ethan replied. "Stronger than she looks." Claire hesitated, then followed him into the barn. They spoke little, but she stayed longer than usual, helping refill water buckets and brushing the mare's coat. When she left, she didn't give him the sharp parting words she usually did, just a small nod and a "see you soon." In the days that followed, the mare began to trust him more openly. She no longer shied when he touched her. She leaned into his hand when he rubbed the spot just behind her ear. He began to call her by a name, Sable, though he wasn't sure why that one came to him. It fit, though, and she seemed to know it was hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the pasture in gold, Ethan stood at the fence watching Sable graze. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth. For a brief moment, he imagined what it would be like to see her foal take its first steps here, to have the ranch filled with life again. But just as quickly, the shadow of uncertainty crept in. Luke's involvement was still a mystery, and whatever debt he believed Ethan owed was not yet clear. The note's cryptic words gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something larger, something that might not end gently. That night, a restless wind rattled the barn doors. Sable shifted uneasily in her stall, ears flicking at every sound. Ethan stayed with her, murmuring reassurances until her breathing slowed again. The storm outside never fully broke, hanging instead as a low, constant rumble over the hills. When dawn came, Ethan stepped out to find fresh tire tracks cutting across the edge of his property. They led from the road to the fence line, stopping 100 yards away. Whoever had been there had turned around without approaching the barn. He stood there for a long time, staring at the faint imprints in the mud, the wind tugging at his jacket. The unease from the night before deepened. Someone was watching. Back inside, Sable greeted him with a soft nicker. He rubbed her neck, forcing his thoughts back to the present. She was stronger now, her ribs less pronounced, her coat cleaner. The foal growing inside her was a promise he intended to keep, no matter who might be lurking beyond his fence. He fed her, checked her water, and settled into the rhythm of the day. Yet the tracks remained in his mind, a silent reminder that the past wasn't done with him. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Ethan stood in the barn doorway, looking out over the darkening land. The note, the initials, the mare's eyes, all of it was part of a puzzle he was only beginning to see. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: walking away was no longer an option. Behind him, Sable shifted in her stall, the faint sound of her breathing steady and strong. It was enough, for now, to know she was still here. But as the first stars appeared, Ethan felt the pull of the unanswered questions, drawing him toward a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The days shortened, and the air turned sharper with each passing dawn. Sable's belly grew heavy, her step slower, but there was a quiet determination in the way she moved. Ethan kept close to her, watching for any sign that the time was near. He had prepared the stall with fresh straw, hung blankets within reach, and kept buckets of clean water nearby. Every small task carried the weight of unspoken urgency. One evening, as the last light drained from the horizon, a cold wind swept through the valley. Ethan stood at the barn door, listening to the restless rustle of branches beyond the pasture. In the distance, a pair of headlights slowed near the far end of his property. They lingered for a moment before turning away into the night. The sight brought back the unease from the tire tracks, the feeling that someone was circling, waiting. Later, while checking Sable's water, he noticed her shifting uneasily, her tail flicking in agitation. She let out a low, drawn-out sound, her sides tightening with effort. Ethan's pulse quickened. The foal was coming. The first tremor of panic tightened his chest, but he forced himself into motion. He fetched clean towels, a lantern, and the small kit Grace had left him. The wind outside picked up, rattling the roof, and the barn lights flickered before holding steady. Sable lowered herself to the straw, breathing hard, sweat already dampening her coat. He knelt beside her, speaking softly. "It's all right, girl. I've got you." The delivery began slowly, each contraction drawing a strained whinny from her throat. Ethan worked carefully, keeping her calm, remembering the instructions Grace had given him. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm outside grew louder, matching the rhythm of Sable's labored breaths. Then the foal emerged, slick and still, its small chest unmoving. For a heartbeat, Ethan froze. The weight of an old memory pressed in. The night he'd lost both a mare and her foal years ago. The helplessness that had driven him to walk away from everything. Not this time. He cleared the foal's airways, rubbing its sides firmly, speaking in urgent bursts. Come on, breathe." His hands moved with a precision born of desperation. At last, a shudder ran through the tiny body, followed by a thin, wavering cry. Relief struck so sharply it left him momentarily breathless. Sable lifted her head to nuzzle the foal, her own breathing ragged but steady. Ethan sat back on his heels, the rush of triumph mixed with something deeper, a release of years of failure and regret. By the time the foal was standing on shaky legs, the storm had begun to pass, leaving only a steady drizzle against the barn roof. Ethan stayed with them, watching the foal nurse, the bond between mother and child already strong. He reached out to stroke Sable's neck. "You did good," he whispered. "Both of you." The quiet was broken by the sound of tires on wet gravel. Ethan stiffened, his gaze shifting to the barn door. The footsteps that followed were slow, deliberate. A figure appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, weathered, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. "Luke Harrington." Ethan rose, every muscle tense. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Luke's gaze moved past him to Sable and the foal. "I see she made it," he said, his voice low. "That's more than I expected." "You left her tied to my fence half dead," Ethan snapped. "Why?" Luke stepped inside, water dripping from his coat. "Because I owed her a chance. And I owed you one too." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a letter sealed in worn paper. "Everything's in here. What happened to your stallion, why I took him, and how she came to be. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to make it right before it was too late." Ethan didn't take the letter immediately. His eyes stayed on Luke, searching for the lies he had expected to find. But there was only a tired honesty, the kind that came from carrying something too long. Finally, Ethan reached out and took it. "You should go." Luke gave a small nod and stepped back into the rain, without another word. Inside, the barn felt warmer. Ethan slid the letter into his jacket pocket, knowing he would read it later, when the weight of the night had eased. For now, all that mattered was here, Sable, standing protectively over her foal, both alive, both safe. In the early light of dawn, Claire arrived, her boots splashing through puddles as she crossed the yard. She stopped short when she saw the foal, her eyes widening. She made it." "She did," Ethan said, "and so did the foal." Claire stepped closer, her voice softening. "She's beautiful." Her gaze shifted to him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You look different, Dad." He didn't answer, but the warmth in his chest said enough. For the first time in years, he felt the ranch breathe again. They stood together, watching the foal wobble around on uncertain legs. Sable kept close, her head lowered to guide it gently. The morning light streamed through the open barn doors, washing the scene in gold. Ethan thought about the note that had started all of this, the debt Luke claimed he owed. Maybe the truth in that letter would cut deep, but it wouldn't change the fact that Sable and her foal were here now. And in saving them, something in him had been saved too. As Claire rested a hand on his arm, Ethan looked out over the pasture beyond the barn. The land still needed work, the fences still leaned, but it no longer felt like the ruins of a life. It felt like the beginning of one. The wind carried the fresh scent of rain over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, the call of another horse echoed faintly. Ethan smiled to himself, a small, private thing. Sometimes the past tied itself to your fence not to haunt you, but to lead you back to where you were meant to be. And this time, he intended to stay.